So we're going to kick off a new section looking at negotiations and international relations and laying down some sort of foundational concepts related to negotiation. So when we think about negotiation, sometimes it's described as a mixed motive situation in which you have two parties who are communicating and there's a difference, there's a problem that they're trying to resolve, and they're trying to come up with some mutually beneficial agreement, right? So they're working together to find a solution, but they're also trying to find a solution that benefits them as much as possible. And so that's why we sometimes think about these as mixed motive situations where I want to work with you as my partner, but I'm also competing against you to try to extract as much value as possible. Typically, what makes negotiations different than other kinds of, carrot and stick kinds of interactions that we see in international politics is that both sides must agree to a solution, which means essentially both sides are equal. They have veto power, they have the ability to walk away. And while there's power differences, certainly when the United States negotiates with Senegal, the fact that the United States is a much bigger, stronger country than Senegal plays into sort of the background calculations. But at the end of the day, for the United States to negotiate an agreement with Senegal, Senegal needs to be willing to say yes to that agreement. And then when we think about what it means to say yes, we oftentimes in negotiation analysis will talk about that in terms of the best alternative to negotiated agreement. What would happen if negotiations failed? What would that outcome look like? What's the fallback? And we'll talk about that both conceptually, and then we'll talk about that and some of the limitations to thinking about negotiations just through that sort of a range. So when we think about negotiations, this is sort of our super simplistic model. And it's a good starting point to kind of wrap your head around some of the vocabulary and some of the ways that people think about negotiations. And so we have two parties, party A and party B, and they want different things that are being represented by this line, I guess, this sort of continuum that runs from zero, which is the ideal point, the preferred outcome. If you had your druthers, what would you get? That outcome for party A, and it runs all the way to 1, which is the ideal point for party B. So they're opposite ends of the spectrum, and they both want these, very divergent outcomes. But they're willing to compromise. They're willing to accept that they might not get everything that they want, and that's what that dashed line is. That's how far party B is willing to go in the direction of the ideal point for A, and I guess A also has a dashed line across the top that reflects how far A is willing to compromise. And so they reach that reservation point, the point where party A says, you know what, I've made so many concessions here, I've moved so far away from my preferred outcome, my ideal point, that at this point, anything else is probably worse for me than no deal, than my best alternative to negotiated agreement, to what would happen if we walked away from the table. And so in theory, anything between the ideal point for A and that reservation point should create value for party A, right? Party A will be better with any solution in that range than if they walked away. But anything further to the, I guess, right, it would be toward the 1 for party A would be a worse outcome because they would be better off just doing their own thing and not cutting a deal. Now you'll note that there's sort of an overlapping shaded area. That's where the range of what party A is willing to concede and the range of what party B is willing to concede overlap. And that's oftentimes described as the ZOPA. Apparently, folks who like negotiations like acronyms. So we have the BATNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement, which sets that reservation point. And we have the ZOPA, the zone of possible agreement. And anything within that range is something that would make both A and B better off. And so in theory, any solution to this difference, this dispute between these two countries would make both A and B better off. So that's a useful starting point. And if we just stick with that and that way of thinking about negotiations, then negotiations becomes essentially a question of how do I divide up the pie? And this is certainly a way of thinking about negotiations. It's sometimes called distributive negotiations, where we're working to settle specific issues and we're arguing over sort of just one dimension, and every concession I make makes you more happy, and every concession you make makes me more happy, and we're just trying to figure out what that looks like. And so that kind of negotiation might pop up when you're thinking about how to buy a car, for example, right? In theory, you're arguing about price. And when you're arguing about price, the dealer wants you to pay more and you want to pay less. And there's probably a range where the dealer is willing to sell to you, and there's probably a range where you're willing to pay, and there may be some overlap, and hopefully you can agree on a price. If that's the kind of negotiation that you're engaged in, it's very much zero sum. Um, right? My gain is your loss, your gain is my loss. We can't both come out better off. And I would suggest to you that there's very few situations in life that actually look like that. They're purely distributed negotiations, right? And so I'll go back to that example I had of buying a car. And a couple of years ago, my wife and I went in to buy a new minivan. And I watched her, and she was sort of masterful in how she handled the situation, because she took something that was very much a zero sum distributive negotiation. We're arguing over price. I want to pay less. They want me to pay more. And she changed it by bringing in new issues. So one of the things that she identified, it was a used vehicle, is that the locks on the door didn't work, right? And so she said, well, the locks on the door don't work. Could you possibly get that fixed for us before we purchase this vehicle? And the dealer said, yeah, that's fine. We've got folks in the shop. They can work in the electronics. They're not doing anything at this particular moment anyway. We're paying them. And so that's an easy thing for us to concede. And it made us much happier. She came back around and said, well, what about an extended warranty? You're offering 6 months. Can we get a full year? And they went back and forth and eventually agreed that that's something that they could provide for a very slight increase in price. And we thought that would make us better off. Then she pointed out that one of the arms on the seats was broken. And she said, well, that's something else that you could fix. And the dealer said, well, actually, no, we can't, because if we fix that, we have to order a part direct from the factory, and that's going to be like, $150, and then we can install it for you, but it's really just a bolt. But if you go down to the local junkyard, you can get that exact part for like $3, and then take it to your own dealer or your own mechanic, and they'll put it on for you for another 15. And it makes much more sense for you to handle it that way than for us to do that. And we said, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what my wife was essentially doing is she was finding different ways that we could make that situation better for ourselves, right? Fixing different aspects of the vehicle, extending the warranty, access to the car wash, those kind of things that weren't really just about price. There were things the dealer might be able to grant us that wouldn't be too painful for the dealer, but would be beneficial for us, that we would gain some value from. And so she essentially took negotiations over a single issue of price and turned it into negotiations over multiple different issues. Essentially what she did is she shifted to what's called integrative negotiations, or growing the pie. And there's lots of different ways that you can create value in negotiations. And some people talk about this in terms of the psychology of how we think about situations. But really what it is it's trying to be creative to find positive sum solutions. And so there's a very famous story I'm going to share with you about the sort of integrative positive sum thinking. Starts out with two people who are arguing over an orange, and the third person comes in and says, oh, what's going on here? And the first person says, oh, I have to have that orange, and I absolutely desperately need it, and it's really important. I have to have the whole orange. And then the next person says, oh, well, you too, you want this orange, but I need it as well. And the sort of moderator, mediator comes in and says, well, could we just cut it in half? Would that solve the problem? And the two parties both scream, no, we need the whole orange. And it seems like this is a completely irresolvable issue, right? That there's no zone of possible agreement that's workable. Both parties want the whole orange, and they're not willing to compromise. But if you start drilling down and start pushing people to articulate, why is it that you need that orange? What's so important about that orange for you? You'll find that one person has scurvy and really needs the vitamin C. And the other person is making potpourri and needs the orange peel for orange smell in the potpourri. And it turns out there's a very easy way for both parties to get exactly what they want, right? Which is different aspects of what the orange can provide. Now that's sort of a cutesy story. You're like, oh, isn't that clever? But what it's trying to get at is this idea that if we just focus on the top line issue of whatever we think we're negotiating about, and we don't drill down to what it is that we're really after, what is motivating us, what are we trying to achieve with this argument, with this dispute, with this negotiation, we can miss ways to address each other's concerns without just focusing on that top line issue, to find other things to bring in that we can use to make each other better off with that negotiation process, right? So my wife brought in the question of the warranty, she brought in the question of fixing the locks. She found other ways to make the situation complex, because what she really wanted was a good quality vehicle, not a van at a particular price. Again, a cutesy story. Let me give you another example of a cutesy story. For years, there's been a dispute between the United States and Russia over missile defense. And the United States has been setting up a missile defense system in Eastern Europe. And Russia has been screaming bloody murder, saying this missile defense system in Europe is a threat to Russia because it's potentially going to neutralize Russia's nuclear deterrent. The United States responds and says, no, that's not the case at all. This isn't about you at all, Russia. It's about Iran. And we want to make sure that European states are protected from Iran's ballistic missile program, right? In theory, this is sort of one of these sort of deadlock situations where both parties are articulating demands that are mutually incompatible. The US says, we want a missile defense system in Eastern Europe. Russia says there can't be a missile defense system in Eastern Europe. It's unacceptable. And that seems to be the end of it, except if you drill down and get to why these countries want what they want. Russia's worried about the West encroaching on its one remaining mechanism to ensure its territorial integrity and prevent attack, right? Its nuclear deterrent. And the United States and the West is concerned about weapons from Iran. It would be certainly possible for the United States to set up part of its missile defense infrastructure in Russia, particularly the radar installations. Getting those radar installations closer to Iran might actually make the system more effective and would give Russia the power to pull the plug if they felt that the system was being turned against them. In theory, you could create a system in which both parties are getting greater levels of security and are getting more of what they want out of that same situation that seems incompatible, just by focusing on what are the things that are shared in common in terms of the real true interests. And both parties desire security and a greater sense of security. Okay, so we've got this idea of integrative negotiations, of getting creative, finding different solutions. It's also worth focusing on this topic of outcomes versus process. So far, we've been talking about negotiations as a situation that creates value. And if you're thinking about negotiations purely in terms of the outcome, then really all it takes for a negotiation to be successful and for parties to agree is to identify something, a solution within that zone of possible agreement, right, that's better than the alternative to no agreement, right, the BATNA, for both parties. And once you find a solution that works, that satisfies that, both parties can agree to it and negotiations succeed. And certainly that's true as far as it goes. It's very hard to think of a situation where a country agreed to negotiations that left them objectively worse off. On the other hand, I think that's a very limited way to think about negotiations and what makes negotiations successful and how do you reach that final solution. And so a lot of folks who study negotiations also think about negotiations as a process. It's human beings interacting, exchanging information, building relationships. It's not just a purely rational calculation. People need to be happy with how that interaction plays out. They need to have a sense that it's fair. They need to have a sense that their interests are being taken into consideration. They need to have a sense that they're able to influence events and that the outcome that's arrived at is something that they can support, regardless of whether or not it's wildly beneficial, moderately beneficial, or maybe even just a wash for them. The more people feel good about the process, the more likely they are to accept that process, to go along with that process, and to agree to a deal in the long term.